Okay, cool. All right. Hello, I'm Brandon. I'm a wildlife biologist here, and I'll talk to you guys about, I feel like most people, how many people kind of know what's going on with the bighorn sheep in the park? Figure a lot, this crew better. They're the wildlife crew, but yeah, so I'll talk about the bighorn stuff, then if we have time, I'll get into some of the bat stuff. I'll also talk a little bit about the mountain lion stuff that's been working on here for a long time, and that's how the Bighorn Sheep Project actually spawned, was from all the mountain lion work and such. So here we go. So this is kind of a collaboration between a lot of different people. So I work closely with the USGS, Oregon State University. They've done a lot of the genetics work on the bighorn stuff. So this is what you think of when you think of typical desert bighorn sheep habitat throughout the Southwest. You have these isolated mountain ranges here in between poor habitat of less quality, but you have all these point water sources everywhere all over the landscape. Grand Canyon is a little different. So the best way to think about Grand Canyon is what? We were just talking, what? Inverted mountain range, yes. Well done. So yeah, so we have basically a huge river flowing right through the middle at the bottom, and you have all this different elevational gradient all through here. And the best way to think about Grand Canyon is think about it elevationally instead of longitudinally like you would in other bighorn sheep habitat. So yeah, no need to show that. So this is just kind of what we've been kind of wanting to look at here at Grand Canyon, some of the objectives. So we're looking at disease is one of the main things, and other identifying threats. Really trying to get a better handle on the genetic structure and actually develop a population estimate for the first time. In the past, it's always been, well, I think there's this many bighorn, but you just really never know. So, and lastly, just kind of looking at the demographics and herd health, looking at survival, puma predation and such, and you can get a lot of this interesting data from the collars that we've actually had out on the landscape. And so this is some of the fun stuff that we do, some of the bighorn captures. So typically in other areas you use helicopters to actually net gun bighorn sheep. Here, because of the terrain and the wilderness character of Grand Canyon, we don't use helicopters for captures. We actually do either boat or ground-based darting, excuse me, ground-based darting along the river. So basically just using a dart gun, finding them that are in range and actually darting them. And yeah, so rams and ewes, sometimes they get to like, this is, a couple hundred feet above the river where actually darted her. So when you dart them, put a dart in their butt, they run. And a lot of times they run up and get into some pretty precarious spots. So, so yeah, sometimes you have to work them in these weird areas, but all success on this project, so yeah. And we've had 25 different collared bighorns, 16 ewes, 9 rams. So every single circle of a different color is actually a different bighorn sheep. So you can kind of see the distribution throughout the river of where we've actually had collared sheep, up in Marble Canyon. This is a big area, a big concentration, roughly, I'm not sure how many folks have been on the river, but this is roughly river mile, 115-ish. To pretty much like 170. That's kind of a big area of high concentration for these sheep. They typically don't move too far. They typically only move about 12 or 15 river miles downriver. It's a very, the system is very linear, so they will go up in elevation sometimes, and there's differences between the rams and the ewes based on life history strategies. The ewes primarily have one thing to do, or not one thing to do, but the primary thing to do is to raise young. So they stay by the river on a yearly basis, taking care of their young. There's good forage down there and such. The rams, during winter, they will move up in elevation because there's better forage. They're actually following the better forage. And the life history of rams is to really get as big as they can so they actually can be successful mating and such. So, so they kind of separate during the winter months. And one of the big aspects of what we've done in this project is we've collected a lot of poop. And so the idea behind collecting a lot of poop is you can genotype it. You can get the genetics, specific genetics from the different fecal pellets. And the idea, and we've collected over 1,600 genetic samples from bighorn sheep during this project. And the different circles are actually indicative of different subpopulations, smaller populations within the larger populations that breed together, essentially. And so you can see throughout Grand Canyon, we pretty much have 4 different subpopulations along the river here, indicated by the different green, or the different colors. And you do have a lot of mixture going on as well. But so these are the ones that actually will hang out together and actually breed, essentially, is the easiest way to look at it. So in addition to a lot of the subpopulation and genetic stuff, one of the main aspects of what we've been doing is looking at survival and mortality. Have you guys heard of anybody know what the #1 cause of bighorn sheep mortality is, besides my crew? Disease, so it's pneumonia. So it's the biggest killer of desert bighorn sheep, no matter where you are in the country. So a lot of people think it's puma predation, and they will have an effect in certain areas, but especially not here. We're having very little effect of pumas on bighorn sheep. So across the board, these are the limiting factors of bighorn sheep populations. So you have disease, forage, predation, which we just talked about, water, competition, human disturbance. And this is kind of the ranking, especially here for Grand Canyon. So disease is the biggest one that we actually have. Free water, we have tons of water. We're very, very different than other bighorn systems because we have tons and tons of water. But disease is basically bacterial pathogens, and it's primarily introduced by these guys right here. So domestic sheep, they've been all throughout, the desert Southwest for a long time. Native bighorn sheep are pretty much naive to the bacterial pathogens. They come in contact because they're attracted to each other, because they're both sheep. And basically, it's primarily nose-to-nose contact, and that's how it's spread. And once it's actually in the bighorn system, it can be perpetuated by other bighorn sheep. You don't have to have continuous contact with domestic sheep. But this is a really interesting experiment that occurred a number of years ago, where they actually had bighorn sheep in the same pen with domestic sheep. The bighorn sheep died, contracted pneumonia, died. They separated them by a fence. The bighorn sheep died. They separated them by a fence of 100 feet away. The bighorn sheep died. So it's pneumonia, it's airborne, and it's very easy for bighorn sheep to contract this. So, and then once they do, it's very, very deadly, as you can see some of the pictures here. So yeah, but it's reduced herds by up to 90% in other places. So it's a very devastating disease. So pneumonia, I've confirmed pneumonia during these years in our sheep. It kind of seems to go cyclical a little bit, kind of like this. These are all animals from the river, essentially, that we found, rams to little lambs right here. Yeah, and so for about 80% of all the sheep that we've actually tested in the park, about 80% are actually carrying the pathogens for the disease. That doesn't mean they have the disease. That means they're carrying the pathogens that can actually go into and form the disease, if that makes sense. So yeah, so they have the germs is an easy way of looking at it. So, and one of the biggest factors for any population as far as declines is recruitment into the system of the young ones. And so this is a dead lamb right here. And you can see the lamb, what we kind of look at is ewe-lamb ratios. And typically you want to have higher lambs to actually use if possible. That means they're actually surviving and recruiting into the system. But here at Grand Canyon, we've actually had, since we've been really looking at this, 2017, 2018 is a little bit better. If I was to show that curve, anecdotally, it would be going back up, which is good. But we've had lambs that are dying quite a bit, and likely due to pneumonia as well. So like I mentioned, it is cyclical, but this is probably going back up about right here, I would say, roughly. So, But yeah, so these are the most important segment of the population, essentially. So making sure they survive until adulthood. Then switch gears just a little bit and just talk about how the dam has really affected desert bighorn sheep here at the park. So everybody knows in '63 or so, this dam went in and it really changed the hydrologic flow. And probably what really hasn't been looked at is the effects of genetic diversity and flow throughout the canyon. We've done a lot of work on our fisheries species and such, but very little work has actually been done on our terrestrial mammals throughout the park, and herps. Tessa. Tessa's going to be developing a herp project kind of based on a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here. So this is a nice picture, isn't it? So just pretty, this kind of marble canyon, beautiful colors, nice flow. But this is not how it's supposed to be, unfortunately. So it's pretty, but this continuous flow on a year-round basis that doesn't really change that much. This has kind of like been potentially the bane of a lot of species' existence here. I got some old historic photos here, and this is kind of how it used to be. So it used to have these huge episodes of these crazy high flow events followed by these boom, very, very low flow events. And essentially, during these low flow events, you just see these boulders all the way across the river. So you don't see that ever anymore. River guides would hate that, essentially, because you couldn't navigate the river, essentially. So in some of the old, so this is all pre-dam conditions, and some of the old naturalists actually speculated, they didn't know for sure, but they speculated that bighorn sheep could hop across the river during low flow events without ever touching the water. So completely different than today. So the exchange from one side of the river to the other was remarkably different than what we actually have today. And that's probably for bighorn sheep, that's probably for other species as well. And so you'd have all these marsh habitats that would form all along the river. You don't see those anymore. So there's little to no marsh habitat along the river. And again, old historic photos going across the river, just all these super low flows being able to boulder hop. So the system has changed remarkably than how it used to be before the dam was actually built. So, and again, looking at that, and this is what's going on. I mentioned, the bighorn sheep are moving roughly between 12 and 15 miles down the river, up and down. But we're having, for our collared sheep, and we had 25 collared sheep, we had absolutely zero movement across the river. So none whatsoever. The genetics shows otherwise. The genetics shows roughly about 7% of all the individuals we genotyped are actually showing some kind of movement across the river. So there is some kind of flow across the river, some genetic exchange, but it's minimal compared to what it probably used to be. And those are probably the young rams moving across the river, trying to figure out and find their harem of ewes and such, and to keep from getting beat up by big rams and such. So it's usually the young males are the ones that disperse more than any other age and sex class. So yeah, so this is a rad photo. Some of you might know Amy Martin. She's a photographer and kind of canyon guru, but she sent me this photo. This is actually Havasu Creek. So this is probably what you used to see, bighorn sheep kind of boulder hopping across the river to get from one side to the other. And so, yeah, it's definitely deterred bighorns from crossing the river, hasn't completely stopped it. It's altered the distribution of bighorns and has probably to some degree lowered the genetic flow. However, there's a caveat here that the genetics of Grand Canyon bighorn are probably one of the healthiest around, which is fantastic. So there's a lot of diversity in the genetics. There's a lot of strong alleles in the genetics that basically allow them to function really well in this particular ecosystem. So we're lucky on that level. So we have, by all indication, our bighorn sheep, if they can survive pneumonia outbreaks and such, they're really in a great place. They have good forage. They have a fantastic river running right down the middle. There's no hunting. So by all indications, which I'll show you here in a second, there's no heavy puma predation on them as well. So they're really kind of in a beautiful little desert oasis, you know. So yeah, if I was a bighorn sheep, this is probably where I would prefer to live out of any other place. So, which is great. So yeah. And so started in 2010, 11. My last bighorn sheep, she just died this spring of unknown causes. I can't say it's pneumonia, but you know, sheep die, it's what happens, you know. So, so basically trying to wrap up the study, and the main thing that's still in development right here is the population estimate. So all of our genetics has been, all of our fecal pellets have been genotyped. The genetics is in the hands of a researcher I collaborate with at basically up in Glacier, so for USGS. And so she's developing habitat and occupancy models and developing the first population estimate we've ever had of desert bighorn sheep here. So for the first time, we'll be able to say how many sheep we have here in the park fairly robustly, which is great. So, and then a few things we're going to continue to do: long-term monitoring, investigate disease outbreaks as they happen, continue to monitor and get ewe-lamb ratios to kind of get an idea of lamb recruitment and survival into the population, and also kind of work with the state on preserving regional genetics. So, which is important. So they're not, because the state moves sheep all over the place. And we just came out with a paper, and it says essentially keep the genetics as regional as possible. So just for the health of these animals and for the survival and for the and to functionally respond well within the landscape, it's better to keep these genes regionally the same, roughly, as opposed to like moving sheep from southern Arizona to northern Arizona and such. So, so that's kind of what we've been doing with bighorn. Anybody have any questions on bighorn in particular? Yeah. Where are they coming in contact with domestic sheep? Well, the Navajos have probably grazed domestic sheep for 150 years, more or less, something like that. So, so that's one area where they've really probably, at least in the past, really come and had a lot of contact. And if you look at that first 65 river miles, if you can visualize the park, the first 65 river miles, that that all borders Navajo. So, and you pretty much don't see any bighorn sheep along that side that borders Navajo. So probably because in the past they've actually have come in contact and they died, and it takes a long time to actually repopulate certain habitats once the population has been wiped out. So that's probably the primary area where they've actually had contact with domestic sheep. So yeah.
Is it continual contact with them?
Nope.
Or is it just like initial contact and then it spreads?
It could be both, yeah. So it could be initial contact. You know, a young ram goes out, commingles with domestic sheep, comes back, brings it back into the population, and then it can be perpetuated within the population itself, within the bighorn sheep population itself. And then there's also what's known as, and this is a real term, a super spreader. So you can have sheep that show pretty much no clinical signs of pneumonia, but actually have the actually pathogens, and they pass it on. And so they're actually spreading it around without actually being affected themselves. So yeah. Yes?
So I can see where Marble Canyon, you know, they would see more sheep. Do you see a difference in those other two sections? Like 115?
As far as disease?
Yeah.
No. So disease seems to be spread throughout the canyon and across all sex and age classes, essentially.
On both sides of the river?
And both sides of the river, yeah. So that probably gets to that yes, there is genetic exchange across the river and spreading it, so yeah. And then, you know, there's areas like, you know, they definitely have sheep outside the park. And, you know, we do probably have some influx and, you know, egress between the sheep going in and out of the park as well. And there's potential for exchange there as well. Good and bad, potential for good, you know, genetic exchange, but it could be bad for actually disease exchange, so, yeah.
Is that spread with humans at all?
No. There is, so the disease is caused by a bacteria called, there's a couple of them, but the primary culprit is mycoplasma. But there is mycoplasma in humans as well, but it's a completely different species and strain and all that. So, yes?
Is it true that this is the only non-reintroduced species in
Excellent point, Raider. Yeah, so as I mentioned, like states like to move bighorn sheep around all over the place, but we've never actually had any direct transplants from other areas inside the park. So by all practical purposes, this is most likely the largest native and natural sustaining population of desert bighorn sheep in the world, probably. So yeah, which is great. So, and that's probably why their genetics is so nice right now. So yeah, yeah. So good point. So yes.
What are they foraging in the winter up on the rim? I mean, why is it like that? I mean, I do notice that.
Yeah, well, different things just become nutritionally important. Different plants become nutritionally important as the seasons go along, and so they're up there actually hitting the more nutritional plant species up there. And I think as far up as I've actually seen them go, as far as the collared animals go, is up on like to the esplanade. So yeah, they usually don't go up any higher than that. They'll stay on the esplanade because if you've ever like seen the esplanade in winter, so there's water sources everywhere. When the sun hits it, there's just water pockets all over the place. So there is water sources up there for them to hit during the winter as well, and also better forage as well.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
I thought you meant like way up here.
Nope, no. So they're just going to go up mostly to the esplanade, but everybody's walked down the BA or whatever has actually seen sheep up higher here too. So they actually are dispersed throughout the canyon elevationally. So yeah, but the esplanade is a great place for them to hang out during the winter. So yes.
Have there been any vegetative fecal studies?
Any fecal studies?
For vegetation.
Oh, as far as like diet composition. There has, but not in a long time. So yeah, there was a guy that actually looked at the comparison of diets between wild burros and bighorn sheep back in the day when we were trying to get rid of the wild burros. And he found out that yes, I can't remember the exact percentage, but their diet overlapped quite a bit, suggesting that burros in certain places were really outcompeting the desert bighorn sheep. So, and that was one rationale to actually get rid of the burros, was competition with native wildlife, particularly desert bighorn sheep. And there were supposed to be follow-up studies after that, and back in the around 70s, I think it was late 70s, wasn't it? So yeah, and there wasn't any ever follow-up. So, happens a lot, do a study, boom, you have money, and then you have no money, so you really can't do anything anymore. Time goes by, and you're like, wow, we should have done that. But anyway, so yeah, so it was about the competition with burros and such. So yeah, yes, sir.
Has there been any studies done about giving the sheep an inoculation against the disease and so on?
Yeah, so every time I would get my hands on a sheep to collar him or her, I would give the animal a product called Draxin. So basically it's a powerful antibiotic that kind of targets respiratory infections. But that's just, a couple of animals, 3 or 4 or 5 in a year. As far as actually doing that, targeting a population to actually give and try to treat, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. So treating it on a population level is just at this point not a feasible application. So.
Well, I meant for the domestic sheep.
Oh, for the domestic sheep? Yeah. Oh, they're fine. They live with they.
Is there something that they could be inoculated for that would not pass this pathogen?
Not as far as I know. No. I mean, they have the pathogens. They live with the pathogens. They've evolved with it. They're fine. But the bighorn sheep, they're pretty naive to the whole thing. Even though they've been, introduced and dealing with it probably for a couple of 100 years at least since we really brought over domestic sheep. But yeah, but so the domestics are fine. The bighorn, the desert wild sheep are not. So yeah.
Sorry, one more question.
That's all right, man. That's what we're here for. So.
The subpopulations, is that kind of a function of just territory, or is it the
Landscape.
landscape?
So yeah. So bighorn sheep are really, they move around based on different landscape. That's one thing we're trying to figure out with the population modeling is like why you have sheep here, but you don't have sheep here. So we're building occupancy models to really look at that. And so the landscape is really going to dictate where sheep are on the landscape and how far they go and who they commingle with and such. So yeah. So, and like I mentioned, we're in a very linear landscape, where they move up and down the river. So they will move up and down as well, but they also move this way quite a bit. So yeah, so it's all a product of our unique landscape essentially. So cool. Okay. So I'll just talk quickly about the lion bighorn sheep connection. So this is a photo that this is a super cool photo I got many years ago. I set up a cache right here. So this is a dead elk, and just put up a camera right here and got this photo. So of two cats, one very, very close up, which is super cool. So this is the kind of stuff we can get, Raider. So Raider's wanting to get a bunch of stuff, a bunch of wildlife video stuff for a project. So I primarily have used stills in the past, but we'll try to get some good video. So yeah, but so if you kind of look at the distribution of the mountain lions that we've had here, had 32 different cats collared on both the north side up here and the south side. And each individual point here is an individual GPS location of a different, of a collared mountain lion. And all these points through here, these are all the bighorn sheep points. So you can really see that there isn't a whole lot of commingling going on between bighorn sheep and mountain lions. So in fact, I've only had one bighorn sheep out of the 25 had collared that was killed by a mountain lion. And you go to other areas and you probably, the mountain lion predation is quite a bit heavier. So yeah, but here, and I won't go into this too much, but what do we have all throughout the South Rim? Elk, yes, they're everywhere. Elk weren't really here until the mid-60s. So, and they've really, really have changed things. The predator-prey system on both the south side, north side, and in the inner canyon as well. So you can really see this separation. In fact, out of all the mountain lion GPS locations, I mean, God, I think it's been 65,000 individual points, locations. Over 90% have actually been on the rim. So it means they're preying either on elk, which I'll show you here in a second, primarily here, or deer, primarily here. And if you look at just the south side, 98% of all the locations are on the rim itself. So the South Rim mountain lions, they're hardly even dropping into the inner canyon at all. We've had a couple cross, but they generally went straight across without really hanging out in the canyon itself. So there's a kind of a fairly significant separation between the two species, so which is great for bighorn sheep. So again, some of the fun, and also it's when you're capturing large animals, whether it's bighorn sheep or mountain lions, it's kind of like half fun and half incredibly stressful. So we use different methodologies for the two. I mentioned we do mostly darting from the boat or from the ground for bighorn sheep. Here we use primarily leg holds, essentially. I don't have any close-ups. Well, there's actually one right here. You see that right there? That's basically, it's a padded cable. So yeah. And so you'd kind of trick them, you kind of get them to go to this one spot, you attract them with like olfactory scents, or you'd actually attract them with it could be a carcass or something. And the idea is you want them to step in certain locations walking up to the trap. And so you put rocks and all nasty stuff where you don't want them to step. And then you put like nice kind of open areas where you want them to step. So they're boom like this. And then right here is where you actually have the trap. And actually it's a foot pan. They put their weight on it. It's hollow underneath. It triggers a throwing arm to catch a cable around their paw, essentially. So it's kind of a intricate little fun deal, and usually, your success rate is pretty low, but we don't use dogs in the park for various reasons and such. We have used them outside the park, the same way you hunt them, same way you can actually collar them. You can run them up a tree instead of shooting them. You can actually dart them, and then generally speaking, as they're drugged, they kind of start working their way down the tree. So yeah, this way is, they both have their pros and cons, but this is the way we probably did it in the park. And my predecessor before me as well. This is Jeff Sikich. He works at Santa Monica Mountains. He's kind of a lion guru out there. Taught me how to actually trap cats. And he also did a lot of trapping with Eric York, folks that have been here for a while. So Eric was a previous cat biologist here that actually passed away. So yeah, but yeah, super fun, you know, and stressful. These cute little guys, you know, you put a dart in them, use a blowgun because you can get pretty close to them, which is fun. So, but they have kind of a fight circle. So if they're like, you know, if they're in a snare here, they have all this area here to go out and reach. So it's called a kind of a fight circle. So it's kind of a circumference you don't want to get in. So.
So are those then tied to a tree? Or
Uh-huh. Yeah, so it's tied to a tree. I use big solid chains essentially to tie them to a tree or to a boulder right here. You can actually see the chain right here a little bit. So yeah, it goes underneath, and I actually put an anchor buried in the ground just in case that doesn't hold. He's carrying an anchor around that gets caught on stuff, but they've always held. So.
And is the band elastic?
Yep, totally. So it's a steel cable, but you use bungees that are shorter than the cable itself. So he goes and he actually stretches, you know, before he gets to the end of the cable, he has these bungees he can actually stretch a little bit. So yeah. And then every time he pulls, it gets tight around his wrist. And then every time he stops pulling, it lessens up a little bit. You know, you still have some swollen paws, you know, but they generally tend to be okay. So yeah, but yeah, they're not usually very happy. So, but especially this guy right here. So this guy's kind of, you can see the cable around him. He was one of the famous mountain lions in this study. He was P4, Puma number 4, and he was captured 7 different times and wore 6 different collars. So he contributed about 11,000 GPS points to the project, so which is super cool. And you know, he just has this look where he's just like, just get it over with. You know, I've been through this before. And say what?
Is he addicted to ketamine?
Probably. He probably has an immunity to it. So yeah, but yeah. So yeah, but you know, super cool cat. He actually lived to be almost 11, which is really old for a male mountain lion in this area, before he was killed by a hunter outside the park. So yeah, which is a common occurrence essentially. So out of all the cats had collared, about 70% of the ones that died during the study died from sport hunting outside the park. So, because the Grand Canyon is big as you think it is, the primary habitat for these guys is on the north and south rims itself, and those rims are quite shallow before you get to Forest Service land and where you're actually subject to being hunted. So, yes.
If they shoot the one that has your collar on it, that doesn't matter, right? They can still take it home if they have like a permit to kill?
They have to give the collar back.
Okay.
So, but it's not illegal to shoot a mountain lion that's wearing a collar. So yeah, so if that was the case, we'd never get our collars back. You know, so you make it legal so you at least get the data back, and it's good survival data too. So yeah, and it's completely legal, you know, so yeah.
Is that primarily trophy hunting? I know there's some population that do eat lion, right? Here.
A lot of people eat, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people do eat lion. But yeah, this is almost exclusively trophy hunting. These are not animals that you're like, oh wow, I really want to eat this animal. You know, most predators probably don't taste good based on what they're eating, other living things. So yeah, but yeah, so it's almost exclusively sport hunting. So yeah. And so to kind of get at, what these guys are eating, the south rim. So they're eating about, it's roughly about 65% elk is their mainstay diet on the south side, followed by mule deer. And then you have all these mesopredators, which they actually consume on a fairly regular basis, and then bighorn sheep, less than 1% of their diet. So as I mentioned, they're hardly dropping in. So North side's a little bit different, about 92% deer is what they're actually consuming, 5% bighorn sheep, and that is a product of one particular mountain lion on the north side. And I think I have some footage of her coming up soon. But yeah, but we had one cat that dropped into the actual canyon, the inner canyon, during winter, and actually prey switched from mule deer to desert bighorn sheep. So yeah.
Are they not eating the bison at all?
No, they don't eat bison. No. So I mean, I had 10 cats over there collared, investigated probably 400 mountain lion kills, and not a single one was bison. You know, they're really big animals, and they're really, really protective of their young. And so a mountain lion's just going to look at them and say, it's just not worth it. So, because as I'll show you here, I think I might have a slide, but you know, mountain lions have been killed by their prey. They've been killed by elk. So yeah, and so going up against a bison, they're a little smarter than that. So yeah, as they should be. But yeah, but you know, I've had, you know, females, a 100-pound female lion take out a 700-pound bull elk. So they're incredibly efficient at what they do. That's not super common, generally speaking. The larger mountain lion you have, they're taking out the larger prey. So it's generally the male mountain lions are killing the big bull elk, where the female mountain lions are going to focus more on the younger elk or the mule deer themselves. So yeah, but occasionally they will kill desert bighorn sheep, rams as well. This is kind of over to the east of Clear Creek. So if you guys know where that is, Phantom, Clear Creek over here. So yeah, and this is the first bighorn sheep kill I investigated, and it took a day and a half to get there. So yes.
Did I see that there was pronghorn on the north rim?
Not on the north rim, so south rim. So yeah, so, and I only had, this represents basically either 1 or 2 pronghorn kills essentially, and it was over kind of south of like Desert View area, so in that pinyon juniper habitat. So nothing on the, yeah, so we do have isolated populations of pronghorn on the south side, but nothing on the north side. Always get the question of, do mountain lions swim the river? Yes, they do. So yeah, which is a super cool image. This was down, way down, like, you know, probably river mile 260, somewhere in there. So where they have the big, awesome, you know, banks along the river that just fall in, and the dead tamarisk on top. So yeah, but yeah, a private river runner sent me this photo a few years back. So yeah, super cool. But you know, but I did have that one cat I was telling you about that did hop into the inner canyon. She was crossing the river by all indications at the exact same place. And essentially this is in the Gems area. So this is like turquoise area, like, you know, river mile, you know, the low hundreds and such. So, and I know exactly where she crossed the river, and some of you guys may have seen this before, but this is a GPS location right here. So she crossed the river exactly when she was uplinking with the satellites. So I know exactly where she crossed the river, which is pretty cool. So, and it's actually a low flow area. At 9 o'clock at night, she crossed this river, went across here, killed a bighorn ram, ate on that for a while, came across here, killed another bighorn ram. So yeah.
Did she stay down there for months?
She was down there for all of winter. She dropped in November, and she came back up to the north rim in about mid to late April. So she was down there for roughly, you know, 6 months. So yeah, then she dropped her collar almost immediately, getting up to the north rim. So when I say dropped her collars, a program, the collars actually drop off on a particular time and date, and that way you can retrieve it and retrieve all the data. That's not uplinked with the satellites because it's all stored on board as well. So, and that way they don't have to wear the collar the rest of their lives too. So.
Was that the same one, or I heard also, I thought I read it in the study that there was one cat that traversed rim to rim in like 8 hours or something like that?
That was early. That was before I got here. That was in 2005. It was a female. And yeah, she went from roughly, she basically used like kind of like the hermit drainage, getting down there, and she went down, crossed the river, and then she was back up on top of the north side in about 12 hours. So it's like, she just sat there, she looked across the river and was like, I'm going there. And then, and then she just motored. And then she dropped her collar. Say what?
What do you make of that? I mean, that is like, I am doing a rim to rim.
Yeah, well, she's probably done it before. She hadn't been collared that long before she actually made that move. And so kind of like this animal, who was 6 years old when I got her, she probably had been doing this for a lot of her life, So I mentioned that most of the cats are rim cats, but there's probably also some cats that use both, obviously. There's probably obligate inner canyon cats as well that just stay in the inner canyon and make their living down there. But all the cats that we've mostly followed have been primarily rim cats. So yeah, with the exception of a handful. So
it just works for them to do that? I mean, because you have such a density of elk and deer on the south rim. Question, like,
Yeah.
is it just like
these animals are very, very territorial. So yeah, but you would expect the younger ones to really do the crossing. She was 6 years old. The other one that crossed that you're talking about, she was about 5 years old, which is middle age for a cat. So they're established at this point. She could have lost her cubs, and then there's other females in the area. There's males just trying to mate and become too aggressive, and she's just like, I'm out of here. So so it happens. So yeah. But.
Did you capture any in the inner canyon? Or did you
Nope.
only capture?
No, it's just, it's hard enough to capture on the rims themselves when you can actually check these traps on a daily basis. Because sometimes you have a trap line set for 2 weeks and you have nothing. So doing that in the inner canyon just is not feasible at all.
You might be missing some of the population?
Oh, sure.
Just in the
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You always miss some of the population, but the idea is to try to get a number of animals on the landscape that's representative of the population to the best that you can, so you can say something about the population. And with 32 different cats, roughly about 2/3, roughly about half and half male to female, I think we did a pretty good job. So yeah.